Election results in France this morning show the far-right National Rally Party in the lead with an estimated third of the vote. This is the first of two rounds of legislative elections. It does not impact sitting President Emmanuel Macron's term, but it's still a sobering rebuke of Macron, who called the snap election just 3 weeks ago. The result puts France on course for its first far-right government since the Nazi occupation of World War II.
That is such a strong statement there. The first far-right government in France since World War II. That's how long it's been since there's been such a sea change in French politics. Now, that's a big issue for France by itself, but it also has significant ramifications for the Russia-Ukraine war and France's support of it, which we're going to get into here shortly. We're hoping to have Ian Puddick, the smartest man in London, to join us because we're going to talk about how these things that are not just happening in France, but really starting to happen all over Europe, and how those changes may portend both in other European countries, especially the UK, which has its own elections coming up on the 4th of July, and how all of that leads back to the Ukraine war, and it shows a shift of popular support in the population of the European Union that is not looking good for Volodymyr Zelensky. But we've had some connection difficulties. I'm not sure what's going on with them. Gary's behind the scenes trying to get those things solved with Ian, so hopefully we'll have him pop up soon. But we're going to continue to talk about what we do know here, because the circumstances could be significant in addition to what's going on the ground and what may be happening elsewhere. And like all these things, it's the combination and the context which they're happening. You can't look at one thing by itself, because everything always has multiple implications elsewhere. And to get a coherent understanding of how all this fits together and what it may mean, we're going to start taking a look at some of that. So we'll start first with France, because that's where the big news was here. And here is the leader of the far right here, the Marie Le Pen's group, but it's headed by a guy named Bordella. And he went on and spoke about what he thought was the big implication of this vote.
3 weeks after the European elections, which led to the call for these early elections, the French people have again delivered a resounding verdict and confirmed their clear desire for change.
And what is that change? Now, of course, like every election, there's a big domestic component, but it's not just domestic component that's part of it, because Macron, whose party was in third place, and you may remember that because of the parliamentary elections in the European Union, which happened about 3 weeks ago, a lot of the far right groups won. And Macron took a chance to say, hey, I want to have a snap elections right now to try to, before this stuff gets solidified or expanded, he wants to have elections to get what he hoped was going to be set in place for his side to be firm, especially his election itself comes up in another year from now. So it doesn't have anything to do with who's the president, but it has a lot to do with what the president can do, because it also decides who's going to be the prime minister. Now, the guy, Bardella there, I just showed you, and this article shows here, he is on record and before the election flat out said that if he is elected to be the prime minister as a result of these, and this, by the way, this is part one of the election. The French elections are a little different than the United States. There's going to be that was part one, and because there's certain thresholds that have to be met, there's a number of the votes that will still have to be done in part two, which is going to be on the 7th of July, so about a week or so from now. And he has said, Bardella thinks that Macron's idea to even think about putting French troops in Ukraine is a crazy one. And he said it will not happen if he's prime minister. And the current prime minister of France, who's trying to say, yes, we want to keep Macron's vision in mind. He had this to say after the election.
Our objective is clear: to prevent the National Rally from getting an absolute majority in the second round, from dominating Parliament, and therefore from governing the country with the nefarious plan it has in mind. I say this with all the force that this moment demands of each and every one of our voters. Not a single vote must go to the National Rally. In circumstances like these, France cannot afford to hesitate at all.
Well, I mean, that's that's one way to look at it. But you just had a stinging rebuke of the leading French parties here. They came in third, so it was the far right came in first, and then it was a liberal, kind of a far left, that came in second, and then Macron's that came in a distant third. So it's not good for his side, and for him to be, saying, "Hey, we need everybody to pull together to make sure we defeat the far right." There doesn't sound like it's going to be, very successful. And, you see those kinds of trends happening all over Europe with the European Union elections that came up 3 weeks ago. There was a big shift to the right. Now, it wasn't as decisive in the across the Europe, but it was significant in it moved further in that direction. Now, politicians ordinarily are paying attention to the trends in the electorate and where they're at, because they want to make sure that they keep getting elected. So ordinarily, they want to say, hey, wherever the electorate is going, whatever the people want, we want to provide the leadership that's going to keep them happy, keep them voting for me. So even if you're not so worried about doing what's right, that you're worried about getting elected, you would be listening to the people. But you see that so far there's been this unwillingness by a lot of the French politicians and a lot of the elite in both the European Union and the United States. We're going to talk about that in just a second as well. But this is a big problem for Ukraine, because if the support among the people starts to shift away from that, and the elite are not paying attention to it, and they get defeated at the polls, then I assure you, as subsequent elections come up, those people who want to win elections are going to start going with where the people are. Now, as we're going to see, and I'm going to show you in a little bit how this is impacting in Ukraine right now and where their leaders are. But let's now shift a little bit over across the English Channel to what's going on in the UK politics. Now, I think we had a video on a couple of days ago of Nigel Farage, one of the leader for the Labour Party, I believe it was. He came out and said, look, the NATO expansion is what led to the war between Russia and Ukraine. He goes, if we're not going to be honest about it, then we can't get anything solved. And that put up a big firestorm, because the elite in the United Kingdom, certainly the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, condemned it. He said, no, that's a terrible thing. He's completely wrong. But the people are starting to go, yeah, but is he? Because it's not as big a shift in the UK, but it still is a shift. And this is what one of the leaders, a guy named Keir Starmer, who after the British elections coming up on 4th of July may well supplant Rishi Sunak, and this may be the next Prime Minister of Britain. Here's what he had to say.
Farage's comments about Russia and Ukraine are disgraceful. I've always been clear that Putin bears responsibility, sole responsibility, for the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And we have always stood behind Ukraine and supported Ukraine. And so far, we've done it united across Parliament.
Now, Keir Starmer is right with Rishi Sunak on this one. Despite they have a lot of differences domestically, on the international scene, they're trying to have a firm hold against that, because they want to keep on going with this war almost no matter what. But that's not everybody in the UK. And in fact, George Galloway, who we've talked about a few times before, has this view that if Keir Starmer wins, that it has some significant negative ramifications for British security.
If Keir Starmer becomes the Prime Minister, within 6 months, Britain will be at war. I don't mean a proxy war. I don't mean special forces dressed up as Arabs or Russians, Ukrainians. I mean an actual war with British forces deployed within 6 months of Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister. And then it's game on.
Now, we were hoping to have Ian Puddick on to give us a little bit, because I know that he's been doing some campaign work for George Galloway, and is a friend of his, and certainly is tied in with a lot of that things going on. But what we can say from what he's been saying really consistently since the time, really consistently his whole career, is that he is opposed to any of these stupid wars. If it's not someone who's attacking his country, then he thinks it's a bad idea to go to war. And that's the case here. And he's concerned, and understandably so. When he was on Piers Morgan a week or so ago, he laid out very clear that he is concerned that the British actions right now are going to potentially spark a wider war. And when he says that he agreed with what Nigel Farage said about that NATO was a problem and one of the causes of the war, because he tried to make this argument, and Piers Morgan was just not having it, because he is just completely locked in with, yes, we have to stay in, Putin good, Zelensky, or Putin bad, Zelensky good. So we just have to go all the way over here and just kind of like put the blinders on about what any of that stuff means. And he thought he caught George Galloway by saying, look, NATO is already 10% on the border of Russia right now. So it's not going to make any difference if Ukraine is in. But see, here's what Piers Morgan didn't understand, and does in George Galloway, if his views are right, even if he's not fully aware of the tactical situation, because what Piers Morgan and all of these guys, Rishi Sunak, completely miss is that the Ukraine, geographically, where it sits right now, is like a big arrow pointing right to Moscow. It's relatively flat ground, and in a big offensive, you could literally roll right into the Russian countryside. In the Baltics, for example, where some of these other percentages that Piers Morgan's talking about on a map, it probably doesn't make any difference. If you're just looking at the borders, you're going, yeah, well, there's already some up here. But if you look at the geography under the map and what it looks like actually on the ground, you see that there's a lot of channeling territory. So it's not good for maneuver, and so it would be easy to capture anybody who come in from NATO side to try to get into Russia. They would all be channeled into destruction zone, and it would be easy. But if NATO comes into the Ukraine, so there's a big, huge border with Russia, then it would be much, much more difficult to defend. So that's why it is crucial. And as George Galloway did point out in that interview, there has been twice that Ukraine territory was used basically as a launching pad for invasions into Russia, that being Napoleon and in Hitler, Hitler Germany. So there is a reason why Russia is afraid of that, and why it's different in the Baltics as it is in Ukraine. They were upset about the Baltics, but they said it's a red line in the Ukraine. So if you ignore that, and now then you continue to say Ukraine is going to come into NATO, and of course there's the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. next month. They're already talking about there's going to be a bridge to NATO. So the very thing that was agitated that caused Russia to go to war in the first place, they're now saying that's going to keep being the case. We are still bullheadedly going forward with this. And I think that's part of the drive and part of the reason why George Galloway says if Keir Starmer is the next prime minister, then he's going to be able to, or he's going to be concerned about possibly going in that direction. And I think I see that we have Ian Puddick on here. So Ian, can you hear me? I can't hear you. Don't have any audio there for a second. There we go. Okay, I got you. Well, your timing is really good because we just played a clip of George Galloway on GB News a few days back saying that if he believes that if Keir Starmer wins, it's going to mean war for UK in 6 months, which got the attention of a lot of people in Europe. And I think that part of the reason was because that if the British government and the United States keeps going in this direction of keep prodding Russia, keep pushing in, that it may cause some war if we don't seek a negotiated settlement. But I wonder if you know any more about what he had in mind when he said that.
Can you just repeat the last bit, please?
Yeah. So George Galloway was on the news saying that he thought if Keir Starmer becomes the next prime minister, that within 6 months, the UK would be in a full-scale war.
Yeah. So Keir Starmer, or Sir Keir Starmer, if I should be so respectful, he's the people behind the scenes. The people behind Keir Starmer are Tony Blair, who's a warmonger. You don't have to be involved in politics to know that. It's not just my opinion. I think it's now an accepted fact. Lord Mandelson. So these people are warmongers. These people that love war. They are globalists. They're Atlanticists. and these are the people that are behind advising Keir Starmer. So it's just a matter of time. And if you listen to Keir Starmer, he's meant to be the opposition. He's meant to be the opposition leader, obviously, to the Conservative government. At no point, at any point, has he ever condemned the war? Has he ever said, look, let's just try and stop the war. Let's just try and get peace. That's the natural thing to do. Can we just stop the killing and talk? Can we have peace talks? Well, we decide the rights and wrongs of it. And there's obviously so many different dividing opinions. There's no dispute on that. The right logical thing is to say, stop killing and talk. Now, every war that we've ever had has stopped when you have peace talks. So can we just avoid the killing and go straight to the peace talks? He hasn't said that. So it's a really fair and reasonable assumption that he will just continue with the British government's mission, which is to support NATO and obviously the Americans in this war at this present time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, yeah, because obviously we're all for negotiations here.
Of course.
But do you have any sense of exactly what George had in mind when he said why he said it's 6 months for a full-scale war, not just a continuation of the Russia war in Ukraine, but he said the UK would be in a war. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, because the Ministry of Defence in this country is ramping up for war with Russia. If you look at my Twitter feed from last September, October 2023, we were in negotiations with the French and the Germans about sending British forces, German forces and French forces into Ukraine to fight Russia, not as part of a NATO alliance, but individually. So this was British forces separately with French forces, separately with German forces, as a European alliance fighting Russia in Ukraine. And I know it's a joke and it's a bad joke, but NATO wargamed this before Christmas 2023, so I think October, November last year. And NATO wargamed putting NATO troops inside Ukraine, and they said that they could push Russia out of Ukraine in 14 days on one assumption that they had air superiority. So as long as Russia don't fight back or fire any missiles, they could do that. It might be true, I don't know. But it doesn't reflect the real world in any shape or form.
No, it doesn't reflect the real. Number one, you can't get air superiority when Russia has like a 1,000 fourth and fifth generation fighters, and Russia has definitely intentionally kept out a lot of its air power with the assumption that they may need it against NATO someday if the war expanded. So they've only used a portion of their air force. But even aside from that, you may recall this big offensive that the Ukraine side tried in the whole of 2023 and absolutely broke their teeth on the first of 5 lines of defensive preparations, which are only stronger now than they were before. And if anyone in NATO is delusional enough to think that just because you have Western troops that come in, which, by the way, none of them have any actual combat experience in high-intensity warfare, none of them, then they're going to go through those 5 lines in 14 days is just absurd to the highest degree. And even if you did, Ian, then you're almost certainly going to get into a nuclear escalation.
No, I'm sure. There's no doubt about that. And when they had that offensive that you just referred to, I mean, the Western media, especially, I mean, we said this in a previous video when we were talking about propaganda. The head of MI6 made it very clear when he went on to Sky News not only was Ukraine winning the offensive, they'd actually captured more land than Russia had taken since the beginning of the whole offensive. And it's just lies. It's just complete and utter lies. But, when the mainstream media doesn't report the lies and it repeats the lies, the average man on the street, what are they going to believe? They would naturally and rightly and understandably so. You want to believe in your institutions like the BBC, for example. We don't expect them to lie to you or mislead you. Unfortunately, they do. But, I think it was Colonel McGregor was saying, last week? So 2 weeks ago, Ukraine lost 13,000 people in 1 week. In 1 week. Now, if you think about the figures from 9/11, how many Americans died, and here we are 20 plus years later, and we're still talking about that horrific episode. In 1 week, Ukraine lost 13,000 people. It's not even a headline. It's not even a headline because we're happy for that. We support that, and we want more. My friend George Galloway, forgive me for repeating him. He says the West, and he's right, are happy to fight Russia to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. And unfortunately, it's true.
Yeah, and you're seeing some of the recruiting going on to try and replace those battlefield casualties, and they're having a really hard time getting that done. In fact, they're only able to whether mobilize or force mobilize is there 5,000 people per month, and by all accounts, even aside from whatever that one period is, that they're having something close to that or more than that every month, which means that they're a net shrinking, whereas the Russians are having between 20 and 30,000 recruit per month, which well overcomes any of the losses that they apparently have. But so then we get back to what the British public is going to do. So we talked about before you came on about what's going on in France and how there's been a shift in that in their population, that they're not wanting to support war, that the Bardella, if he becomes prime minister, after they have their election on the 7th of July, the next round of it, he says absolutely no French troops are going to be going into Russia, period. And so now that here in the British side, you got elections coming up on the 4th of July. And one of the things one of the reasons I would imagine that George Galloway made that statement is because he wants people to be focused on, we don't want, the status quo to continue going on. But the question that I have of you, and I know you've been really paying a lot of attention to British politics, is that message going to resonate, or will the British population still vote to keep things in the status quo?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. It's the $1 million question. There's two. I'll give you several answers, if I may, and I'm not avoiding answering your question. So if you look at Parliament as it is, it's pro-war as it stands, pro-Ukraine. People just don't know the true story of what really happened because they're not told it. So, and they are told that if you hear this, it's a Kremlin lie or a Russian Putin propaganda. The head of the Reform Party, which has just really come into force in the last month, Nigel Farage, he's now labelled far right, extreme right. It's nonsense. Is he right wing? Absolutely. Is he far right neo-Nazi? Of course not. It's nonsense. But it's just propaganda. And he's stated that NATO provoked this, and just so that, and obviously he's now labelled in the mainstream media on the front newspaper, on the front of the, say for example, the Daily Mail, is that he's a Putin propaganda, Putin puppet, and all this kind of nonsense. But there's a talk of his from 2014 of him in the European Parliament saying that the EU is heading to war and forcing Russia into this position. So this isn't new news, it's online, but it obviously was never really covered because the mainstream media parrots the status quo.
It's funny you mentioned that. You made that comment there because I watched the Piers Morgan interview with George Galloway, and that's one of the things that jumped out at me, that Piers Morgan said, you're a really smart guy. Ordinarily, you and I agree on many things, and I think you really are a smart guy. But I just wonder why you want to be a Putin apologist, because that's where the position you're at. And I did scream at the screen and say, what are you talking about? This is the ground truth observation and reality. It's not pro-Putin to say, here's what's happening on the ground. But to ignore all that is to take policies that can't succeed.
No, that's right. And you can see, if you take Piers Morgan as a really good example, he's a bright guy, he's a smart guy. I mean, I've seen him do some really important, crucial political interviews with British politicians where he's taken them apart. And I mean, really taken them apart. And you think, yeah, great. Good on you for doing that. So he's very, very capable of being very objective and asking the right questions. But he swallowed the Kool-Aid on this. I mean, he said in that same interview, he would send his own sons to die for Zelensky. Now, Colonel, you're a dad. You're a dad. There's nothing more precious than being a dad or a mum. There's nothing more precious in the whole world. Would you send your kids to die for Zelensky? You don't need to answer that. I know the answer. I mean, it's ridiculous. And he really believes that. He's not just towing the party line or towing the state's line. He really believes what he said.
But even if you are willing to make such a supreme sacrifice, you should require, before you would agree to make that sacrifice, that doing so would have a positive outcome, as opposed to what we see being happen to all of those people in Ukraine right now, where they're being thrown into battle without the possibility of helping. It's almost, if not certain death, it's a very high probability and no probability of success. And that's the part I don't get. Why would you be willing to make that kind of sacrifice with no rational prospect of success?
I can't answer that question. It's too insane. It's too insane. And think, I've got a little boy. A little boy is my world. Nothing's more important to me than my little boy. And the thought of me saying to you, Colonel Daniels, I'm going to send my little boy when he's grown up. I want him, it's just nuts. It's just nuts. And how Piers Morgan, who is bright and smart and intelligent, like him or loathe him, he is all of those things without a doubt. How he hasn't exercised any critical thought on such a vital or important subject, I just don't know. I just don't get it. But Lord Cameron, so David Cameron, former Prime Minister, now come back as Foreign Secretary, he was spoofed last week by those Russian pranksters who phone up all the heads of the European states pretending to be Zelensky. And they open up. It's hilarious. I mean, it's absolutely hilarious. They did Ben Wallace a couple of years ago, I call him Minister for War, Defence Minister, but Minister for War. And he was in the back of a London black cab, and he's talking away and he's giving away secrets, and he doesn't even know who he's talking to. It's just insane. But Lord Cameron, or David Cameron, said last week when he thought he was talking to Poroshenko, the previous Prime Minister. He was saying that he's had to talk France out of sending any soldiers to Ukraine. He said it's just not going to happen, and the reason it's not going to happen, in theory, it sounds great. Let's get British troops in there. Let's get some French troops in there. Let's get some German troops in there. Let's just push the Russians out. Sounds great. However, what happens when they all start dying? That's what he said, because that's what's going to happen. They're all going to be killed, and then we've got a bigger problem. So they're not. They all talk robust. They're all very tough-minded. But they're not really, because if they really were, they would do something, and they're not. Sending weapons, the Russians are destroying them, that they're out of patriots. It's insane.
Now, you mentioned Germany there, and that's another indication, which is why I think a lot of eyes are going to be on both the UK election on the 4th of July and the second round of France on the 7th of July, because in the German far right, who their parties were expressly against continuing the war, supporting Ukraine against Russia because they wanted it to be over. Since they were elected 3 weeks ago, they have been growing stronger. So they have added to their strength and people following, and there's a decline in the governing parties, which is one of the things we were talking about, I think, right as you were coming on here, that politicians ordinarily want to get reelected. So they start listening to the population if they're going in an opposite direction, because they don't want to lose their seats. So one wonders if the trends are going to continue going in this direction, if it's going to have any impact on, especially on these two elections here, because the New York Times also, I think it was just yesterday, or maybe even been today, I can't remember the date on that one. They said, look, with Macron and now Biden vulnerable, so is all of Europe. And by that, they mean the support for the European war effort with Ukraine. And man, we hadn't talked anything about the Biden part yet, but man, he's just in free fall in the United States. And Biden himself keeps saying, no, I'm going to stay in the race. And you have senior Democratic officials across the board. You have the New York Times saying that he needs to withdraw and he needs to resign. CNN, MSNBC, ABC News. I mean, all of these people are talking about it. So in my view, it's irrecoverable. He's just not going to be able to stand for re-election. And the chances of any Democrat winning at this point is quite low. And you have Trump unequivocally saying, if I get elected, we're going to bring this all to a halt really quickly. In fact, he claims he'll get it done before he even takes office. But so with all of those movements going on, with what's happening in Germany, what's happening in the European Union, the trends are definitely moving against supporting the war any further among the population. Now, as you and I have talked about before, specifically in the UK, and for reasons you've mentioned about the BBC and several others, that the population is not quite there yet. But as I understand, you've been doing some canvassing for George Galloway in his current bid to get reelected here. Do you see any sense that the people actually care about this more when they're aware?
Interesting. I think from physically knocking on doors, just work in a working class area, just normal, down to earth working people are interested in local issues. So, did the war was it raised? Not very much is the answer. People just want people have broken roads. We have issues with schooling and education. Obviously, the health service is a big issue. I know, speaking directly for George on George's behalf, campaigning in Rochdale, the government closed the maternity ward, I think about 10, 15 years ago. So you could no longer be born in Rochdale. If you were brought up in Rochdale, now you'd be born in Manchester, which is, to be fair, isn't that far away. But George has actually secured funding for them now to reinstate a maternity ward. And people like that. I talked to lots of people that worked in healthcare service that were older or were retired and say, that's great. You should be able to be born in your birthplace, i.e. Rochdale. So people were concerned about things like that. But until it gets into the mainstream media about what really happened, I mean, we have plenty of investigative journalists online, but my parents wouldn't be online, for example, so they wouldn't see what's really going on. People of a certain age might not be online. People that are engaged in politics, like you, that want to understand, you look at a whole breadth of mediums to get an overview of what's going on, get a feel for the flavour or the mood of the population. Not everybody does that. If that makes sense.
So let me ask you this question. So there has to be an active effort by the elite in the UK to make sure that people don't talk about the war, or if they do, it's just about Putin bad, Zelensky good. Obviously, we want the good to win, but I say there can't be a complete absence of understanding that this can't win, they can't succeed for the UK side. But so I guess there's really two questions here. First of all, let's just take the most basic one. Do the elite in the Britain actually, are they aware that the war can't be won?
It's a great question. It's $1 million question. I'm sure. It's a great question. So I'll come back to the elite. So people in the MOD at a senior level, absolutely. However, politicians at a very senior level, the strategy, the narrative direction comes down, and those people in areas of power, responsibilities, just filter that same down. But as you know, because of what I do with the MOD, talking to various people, they certainly know what's happening. They know that.
Well, then that leads to the next question, and we'll just stick with the ones that do. We won't talk about the ones that are not aware. Of the ones that are aware, what is the motivation and the value, politically or anything else, to continuing a narrative which they know can't logically ever succeed? Where's the value in doing that as opposed to changing the narrative to match what's on the ground and trying to find some advantage that way?
Okay, so this just reverse your question, if I may. So if you were Joe Biden and NATO and the heads of all these people that for 2 years have been saying Russia will collapse imminently with sanctions, you've got the Rand Corporation and all of the media parroting about how Russia's on its last legs. You've got the support of the BBC saying Russia's out of ammunition and they're fighting with shovels. That's an actual BBC headline. So it's just a matter of time. Keep pushing and pushing. Russia's weak. Russia's getting weaker. They're on their last legs. You've said that for 2 years. How do you go, actually, do you know what? Actually, that's completely not true. And Russia's really quite strong and they are doing this and they're doing that. How do you change that narrative? I breakfast with George Galloway last Friday morning. Was it Friday morning? I can't remember. Last Thursday or Friday morning. And I asked this question, and I said to him, why is Germany destroying its economy for Joe Biden? Joe Biden doesn't even know what day it is, and they are dismantling their economy. Why would they do that? And he shook his head. I mean, there is no magic wand. There is no direct answer to that question. But everybody sucked up the Kool-Aid several years ago, or even pre-war, that Russia is weak. A few gentle sanctions, and they'll collapse. And obviously, it was wrong. It was utterly wrong. Rand wrote a detailed report, Rand Corporation, that saying about how Russia would collapse. And they revised that, by the way. They revised that after it all didn't happen. I mean, they just got it utterly wrong. But everyone's bought into this. So, I asked George, and I'll tell you, I genuinely, I said to George, have all these European leaders and heads of state and people in military power and positions of authority bought into the fact that we take over, we get rid of Putin, for example. Now, Russia, whether you like them or not, have all of the oil, gas, all the precious minerals, gold. They have abundance of all of these things that we want and we need. So if we simply get rid of Putin, install some puppets, which we're very good at doing, and it all going horribly wrong, by the way, but we're good at the first bit, and then obviously we're not good at the aftermath because we don't think that through. And we do that in the interests of democracy. Forget the Russian people; they don't have any say in this. We make the decisions who's going to be in charge of them. But if it all does go to plan, we then reap the rewards of all the gold, oil, whatever they've got, all their precious, I don't know. I mean, and he said, it's possible. It's very possible. It is insane, but possible.
Well, it may be possible for them to think that way. It is not possible to actually accomplish it. And listen, we talk about some of the British public. We definitely talk about some of the American elite and the current administration that's just been behind this delusionary thinking from the outset, and they've never paid attention to the ground truth reality. But someone else who hasn't paid attention to the truth, except for one flash of a moment, is Volodymyr Zelensky. And I want to show you something that Gary put together here that kind of stitches together something Zelensky said with great confidence in April. And then after, right around the time when Biden had his huge gaffe in the presidential debate, he changed his tune a little bit. But watch this first.
Our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years.
We don't have too much time because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield and through civilians. That's why we don't want to have this war during years.
So he recognized at that time that, okay, we don't have a lot of time here. And I think that he probably recognized it when Biden had that moment. I think he recognized politically, as I did, that I don't think that he can recover from this. And you know what Trump is saying about all this stuff. And so for a moment, it looked like maybe he's recognizing we actually do need to find an end to this, because as soon as Biden's gone, the new guy's not going to be supporting us here. But then 3 days later, he had an interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Gary, if you can throw that there, where he's like laying out how Ukraine can win. And he just has to say, look, Wes, you just have to lose your fear of Putin. And he went on to have some just nutty things in there. He was asked point blank, how can you win this war if you don't have the personnel? And at first I'm like, okay, finally somebody asked the right question, because I've said it's men, it's not machines, it's not money. If you don't have the manpower, doesn't matter how many other things you have, you can't win. But he just said, no, actually we can. And he claimed in there with no justification, for every dead Ukrainian, there are 6 dead Russians. And, there's no evidence of any of that. And to suggest that that's the case, that he admits that they have a 5 or 10 to 1 disadvantage in firepower, almost no aviation, no air defense, but somehow they're inflicting a 6 to 1 casualty. I mean, it belies any kind of logic. And there isn't any, because it's not true. And yet he wants to keep throwing men into the meat grinder. And it's just nonsense about how much just disillusion or illusionary policies that there are.
Yeah, it's just nuts. I mean, it's just nuts. But, he's the man. He can't change the narrative. How could he? He's the one person that absolutely in all of this could never change the narrative, because it's over. The minute he changes the narrative, he's toast. It's over. So it's just insanity. But you've seen, you've seen the just pulling people off the street, old men, infirm people. It's just insane. Just doing that to your own people, and you can't win. you know you can't win. And that is criminal. That is absolutely criminal.
Well, it is. And I mean, you say, he can't change his narrative. Well, of course he can. Because look, I think, and I've had some experts on this channel who have talked about it and said that he is taking his life into his hands because you can't just hope that forever that your own people are not just going to allow you to have this delusion and just keep throwing their sons and daughters and fathers and whatnot into the flames of destruction with no possibility of winning. If some of them taking some action at some point, whether it's a coup or something even worse. But I think that he's just gambling that's never going to happen because I don't care about politically, just morally, you just have your conscience at some point says, I can't keep going down a path that can't succeed. And all of my countrymen, I just keep throwing in there when you see all the trends politically, like we've talked about in this show, militarily, which we've talked about in previous shows, there is no path to even maintaining the status quo, much less turning it around.
But he doesn't care about his countrymen, because if you cared about your countrymen, you wouldn't do that. So, to say, I can't do this to my countrymen, we need to change, that's not a man that cares about his countrymen, because that should not be happening in a democracy, and depending on what you call a democracy, that's not really a democracy anymore. All the opposition, political opposition are in prison. All of the political opposition newspapers have been cancelled. I mean, that's not democracy. He's cancelled the election, so he's technically out of his time frame as leader. That's not democracy. And they're just rounding up people. And once you get in that van, that clip that Gary just showed, once you're in that van, you're toast. Within a week, you're going to be dead. There's a video, and I looked for it earlier. I couldn't find it. There was a video of drone footage going over the battlefields, and it's just littered with dead, rotting bodies. Just littered with dead, rotting bodies. It's horrendous. They don't have the manpower to collect the dead, to give them a dignified burial. They don't have that. And you see from there, it's sick. It's absolutely, and we support this. No one in Britain saying, let's stop this. But there was talk, I messaged you earlier, I don't know if you saw the message. There is talk that within NATO, that if the EU can get some sort of peace deal, peace talks, so just so the fighting stops, so there's some interaction, some talks during the peace talks, or which won't be guaranteed, but they'll be talking, they will quickly try and get Ukraine into NATO, because they're not at war, they're not fighting, they're in peace talks, and then the resumption of war, any sort of hostilities means Article 5. So they can. I mean, it's just all insanity.
Wait a minute. Who thinks that's even possible? Who thinks that?
The EU. The EU.
I mean,
it's more insanity.
The thing is, for that to happen, you have to get all 32 members. It has to be unanimous. It can't be 99%. It's got to be 100%. Viktor Orban is absolutely out. That will never work.
No way. No way.
Slovakia.
No way.
Probably others don't want to get into a war with Russia, because they know it's going to go nuclear.
But how desperate do you have to be to float such a? It's like Alice in Wonderland politics. It's just talking nonsense. It's just. I like to think my little 7-year-old boy could do better.
I think that there's a good chance of that.
But it stinks of desperation, the fact that such an insane idea has been floated.
Yeah, I don't know what they're, aside from not being able to get their own people to vote on that. I mean, just because you'd have to be suicidal to sign into something like that. Even if they did somehow get them all to vote into that, the idea that somehow that would tie Russia's hands? No.
Well, I think it's no. I think it's the threat of it. So imagine, just for argument's sake, Alice in Wonderland politics. Imagine they could sneak Ukraine into NATO during the peace talks. So NATO is now part of. Ukraine is now part of NATO. Right. They can now threaten Article 5 as a negotiating point against Putin. If you don't leave, we will bomb you to kingdom come. And you're taking it's step by step, as slowly as possible, to the brink of nuclear war. But
yeah. No, I got that 100%. But what I'm trying to say is anyone who's thinking the way you just articulated is suicidal
Yeah,
because
of course.
Putin has been unambiguous and clear for months, especially recently, that if you take that step, I have a nuclear doctrine and I'll use it. So it won't work because he'll say, you're definitely coming after me now. And if you try now, it's me against NATO openly. The only path he has is nuclear weapons. He doesn't have the conventional forces to do it. So that guarantees nuclear war. And it's insane.
Yeah, it is. It is. And the person that said it to me, his exact words were, it's insane. It's insane. But you got to remember, if they do go down this,
somebody thinks that way.
No, but if they do go down this Alice in Wonderland politics idea, they will have all of the Western media on their side, remember. So the narrative will be shaped and framed in such a way that Putin's the aggressor. It's a lose-lose.
Well,
I mean, I'm just saying
that may be for a while, but again, it won't matter if you have all of the media on your side. Those nuclear bombs don't give a crap about your social media.
No, of course, they don't discriminate. They don't
discriminate.
Lord! I'm not here to raise your blood pressure. I promise. Have a gin and tonic.
I've got some of your gin, so I may go get it after the show. Oh man. Well, listen, Ian, I really appreciate you coming on today and giving us some clarity and illumination of what's going on the UK side, especially about some of the parts of Europe. And we're just going to have to hope that by illuminating these things and putting the truth out there, that enough people can get hold of this and look at the fundamentals and the facts and go, hang on, what I'm being told at the mainstream media does not line up with reality, and I don't want to die. So let's hope that we get enough truth out there that we can actually move the needle.
And can I just say one thing? You asked me earlier when I first joined we were talking about Parliament, and I said there was a couple of issues, and then we digressed. Just to go back to one of them, really, what is really needed here in the UK is a change in Parliament. I don't just mean get rid of the Tories or get rid of Labour or anything like that. We just need more independent voices in Parliament to change the narrative. And George Galloway reached out to Nigel Farage the other day, and when we were canvassing on doors, we were saying that if you're not voting, don't vote Labour, don't vote. If you're not going to vote for the Workers' Party or for George, vote for Reform, vote for Nigel, because you need his voice in Parliament, because he's like George. He's unafraid to speak truth to power. He's unafraid of anybody. He's a fantastic debater. He talks a lot of sense. So you need people like him and George, even though they differentiate on so many different points. You need those voices of dissent in Parliament to create questions and debates that are meaningful, if that makes sense. I just wanted to get that in.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that that's exactly how it works out there. I mean, we need a change in this country as well, and we're going to have an election coming up in November, and we hope that we can follow that. And I'll be really interested in seeing how your elections come out. And I'm sure we're probably going to want to have you back on after that election to talk about how it goes.
With pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Right.
Thank you very much.
And we thank you guys for joining us today. In fact, stick with us, because at 1:00 this afternoon, we're going to have Doug McGregor, who's going to come on, and we're going to talk about more about the Zelensky aspect of this and the military part. Is Zelensky trying to drag the U.S. into World War III? Let's hope we don't participate in that, because it sure looks like that's what he wants to do, or at least that would be the consequence of it. Tune in at 1:00 today. Be sure and like and subscribe, folks, because that's one of the ways we can expand our message here. But I promise you, you do not want to miss Doug McGregor this afternoon at 1:00. Thanks, and we'll see you soon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.